are united in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
We are doing this in our open democracies, discussing this all open and loud, and I'm not for that.
What is European Union? What is freedom? How we learn together.
The obvious question is, what is the EU doing? What is our plan?
Hi. So when I walked out, there was a long line for the women's room and for the coffee. And when I walked back in, both had settled down. So I hope you all had a good break. As we heard before we left, clearly innovation and access are still a pretty tricky balance to make, particularly in the face of budget constraints and new priorities stretching resources. We heard Sandra Galina talk about how everything needs to be linked to defense and war these days. But she also said, no time to waste. So who here thinks the pharma package trilogue will wrap up by the 10th of December? Raise your hand. Okay, pretty pessimistic crowd here, probably realistic. But some of you are optimistic, and many of the solutions just mentioned by our speakers previously do offer some hope. National pricing mechanisms, better clinical trials, and joint procurement. So on that note, Politico's own Claudia Chiappa is up next to unpack what's at stake in the Critical Medicines Act. I'll see you right after this session, so give Claudia and the speakers a warm welcome as they join us on stage.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. I'm Claudia Chiappa. I'm a healthcare reporter here at Politico, and we're here today for what I'm hoping is going to be a great discussion on the Critical Medicines Act. A few years ago, I'm sure we all remember, Europe discovered the hard way how easily its shelves could run dry of very essential medicines and countermeasures from masks to paracetamol. And today, the Critical Medicines Act is Brussels' promise that this can be fixed, and its promise to answer this fragility that Europe can prevent future shortages by fixing its dependence on third countries and strengthening supply chains and in-house production. The act is currently being negotiated both at the Parliament and at the Council level, so there might be still lots of changes from the initial proposal, but we're here to hear more about how it can achieve what it sets out to do. So join me in welcoming our speakers. We have Rainer Becker, Director for Medical Products and Innovation at DG Sante in the European Commission, MEP Tomislav Sokol, who's the lead rapporteur of the Critical Medicines Act and a member of the Sant Committee, the Health Sant Committee, Rodolphe Roche, Global Head of Trade and Revenue Management at Sanofi, and last but not least, Adrian van den Hoven, Director General of Generics Lobby Medicines for Europe. So please, round of applause for our speakers. Thank you all for being here. I'm sure you will notice also this is an all-men panel, 2025, I know. We did try, but unfortunately, there weren't any women available for this, but I'm sure nonetheless we will have a great discussion here with our panelists. And heads up for the audience, we will wrap up the session with a short Q&A for the people on site. So make sure you're thinking about questions that you'd like to ask our panelists at the end. So I would like to start now with kind of like a quick yes or no question to assess how everybody's feeling about this very important legislation that was brought forward, was one of the first things that the new commission did this year. Do you think the Critical Medicines Act as a legislation has the potential to make a meaningful difference for Europe? Let's keep it short just to kind of get the conversation started. So, Rainer.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think because it has all the relevant tools on the supply side. We have this, different ways to support strategic projects. We have on the demand side public procurement measures, joint procurement, and even outside the act, the colleagues in competition have issued guidance on state aid. So I think all the right tools are on the table, and it will make a difference, the package, if we all use them.
Thank you. Tomislav?
Yes, definitely, yes. I will make a provocative statement. I would say that the global order that we're used to is dead. And now it's essentially every part of the world, every power for itself. And here, if EU does not start to defend its interests, just the opposite of what it did when we made this so-called agreement with the US, if we don't start to protecting our interests and see how we can get strategic industries to Europe, to stay in Europe, to remain in Europe, but also to attract them to Europe. And definitely pharmaceutical industry is one of the top 3 or 4 strategic industries, like food production, digital, military industry, and pharmaceuticals. These are the things that you cannot do without. So this legislation is essential if you want to protect European interests, if you want to make it possible for Europe to survive in this global competition when the brutal force is the only leverage and the only criteria that remains. And I think if you see what Trump is doing with this pressure that he's putting on pharmaceutical companies to invest tens of billions of dollars into the US, if you see, taking into account the fact that they impose 15% tariffs on innovative medicines, if we don't do something, in 10 or 15 years, we'll become as dependent on imports of innovatives from the US as we are dependent on imports of generics from India and China. And so we want to prevent that from happening, and also we want to bring at least part of the generic production back to Europe, because if we are dependent on the others, then our long-term perspectives are not very good.
Okay, thank you. Rodolfo?
Right. Yeah, no, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to join the panel. Very honored to be sitting next to very distinguished policymakers and legislators. So it's for me, I have more of an operational background. I hope I can bring that perspective to the discussion. I think for Sanofi, we welcome the CMA as it can strengthen the European pharmaceutical resilience and supply chain. We do believe it needs to be done carefully, focused on the issues that have been identified to prevent unintended consequences in its deployment. Myself, I've lived my whole career operating markets for the company that I work for and other companies before, and I live and leverage and sometimes struggle with policy, with legislation, and I know that if it is done carefully, it can be very positive. If it is a bit vague, it can lead to unintended consequences, it can lead to disruptions and other issues. So that's the key concern that I bring.
Thank you. Adrian, yes or no?
Yeah, so I think it can definitely make a big difference with a few minor tweaks. I think the real issue here is that maybe for the first time, the Commission has really put together a legislation that is looking at how demand affects the investment in the supply and the manufacturing. And I know there's a lot of resistance from the member states to this concept, but I think if we don't have some coordination, which doesn't mean the Commission dictates what the member states do, but some coordination around this, then there won't be a driver for the investment. It's very, very clear that the European supply of critical medicines is extremely consolidated and consolidating, so continuing to consolidate. And this is driven entirely by how we organize the markets in Europe. So this change to the thinking of how the markets, let's say how the criteria of the markets to be applied by the member states there is really the key.
Thank you all for the introduction. I think it sounds like the consensus is, yes, this legislation does have a lot of potential, but with perhaps from some people a few tweaks. So can't wait to hear more about what we think these tweaks are. I want to start with Rainer. I will come to you first, because obviously we had the Commission's original proposal out back in March, and it might not be obviously how it came out, how it eventually ends up being the actual legislation. If you had a wish, what do you think are some of the key elements that you think are the most essential to actually making a difference for Europe? If you had a wish of one couple of things that you hope really make it through trilogues, what would they be?
It's a challenging one, because I really firmly believe what I said at the beginning. It's a broad toolbox with several very important key tools, and it's always difficult to favor one of the children. I think it really is the mix of the demand side and the supply side, picking up on what Adrian was saying. So on the supply side, strategic projects for API and finished medicines, facilitating the administrative procedures, facilitating financial incentives, but maybe even more importantly, on the demand side, really to have in the criteria for public procurement, if we are talking about a critical medicine where vulnerability analysis has shown that we really crucially depend on other parts of the world because, for example, there's only one API supplier very far away. By the way, it's not only about strategic autonomy, the Critical Medicines Act, it is about strength, it's fighting shortages, it is really improving availability of medicines. And you can have dependency also with EU production. So it is also about strengthening the European manufacturing capacity, but it's not only about that, there is a very, very, very strong public health angle there, making sure that patients and health systems have access to the medicines. So therefore, I think what is really maybe even more important, let me dare and favor one of the children or one of the tools in the box, are the measures on the demand side. That we set out really the requirement, what does strengthen the supply chain does not come for free. So there's a cost for holding stocks in Europe. There's a cost for having a second or third API supplier and not having a more attractive exclusive contract. So there's a price tag to all those things. So I think what's really important that we have in the public procurement rules that we are smart. We have smart criteria where medicines are critical, that we stop the practice of just going for the cheapest, even having a legal requirement in member states that it would be illegal for procurers to use smart procurement criteria. I know several examples where tenders were annulled because actually the procurers had put in the criteria other considerations than just the lowest price. We cannot just have the lowest price for critical medicines. And where the vulnerability analysis has shown that we really have a strategic dependency, it can also then be the requirement to produce in Europe. It doesn't have to be 100%. It can be 30, 40% can be sufficient. Again, think of the price tag. Sufficient to get us over a bridging over a period of 3-4 months of shortage with that in Europe. And very important, that's why I'm emphasizing the demand side and the procurement. It is to have those criteria out there. What do we want as a society? For certain medicines, we may need, say, 30% production in Europe, but then put it out there in the tenders and let companies compete for it. And that is, I think, also with a price tag in mind, a way to have the most efficient, most competitive outcomes, not just raise prices across the board and hope and pray that economic operators, that then things would fall into place and everything would be fine. I think having a clear criteria out there, if we think we want for certain medicines some buffer stocks, if we want a second or third API suppliers in the back pocket at least, and all those measures, maybe some state-of-the-art supply chain management, all those things don't come for free, but put them out there in the procurement criteria, let companies compete for it, and that, I think, is the way to have really balanced and most competitive outcomes.
Thank you, for mentioning the procurement criteria. I think it is one of the elements that really stood out, I think, to a lot of people from the Act that obviously was, I think, most people received, but it did raise concern about cost, which also Sandra Galina was asked about earlier this morning. She did say that she thinks that when looking at the Parliament and the Council, this might not be their highest concern cost. It's more about security of supply. Is this a concern for in the Parliament, how perhaps some of these changes will lead to higher prices, whether Europe can afford more made in Europe, or would you agree that other things are taking on most of the negotiations, Tomislav?
So first, the prices are set by the member states. So pricing and reimbursement systems are a national competence, so we cannot intervene there directly. But I would say that let's put it like this. I think that we have two main objectives here. One is to bring production to Europe and retain the existing production to Europe, so to strengthen our strategic autonomy, not to be dependent on the others. That's one thing that was mentioned here. The main tool here is joint procurement and by Europeans. So the idea is that you give preference to those companies which produce in Europe. Here, the Commission went into that direction, where they said that that a significant proportion of production has to be in Europe, but we in the Parliament want to make it clearer. We want to make it more precise. So we want to put some numerical thresholds there to actually say what this significant proportion means, because if it is too vague, too broad, then it can be interpreted in different ways. So that's one thing. So very strong by European with very strong, clear numerical precise criteria. That's the most important, to know what it means to have significant proportion of production in Europe, so that you get preference in public tenders and public procurement. So that's essential in terms of strategic autonomy. The one tweak that Adrian was, I think, referring to is also multi-winner tenders. That's especially important in the generic market, where we are in many cases dependent on only one supplier, so we have to extend this. We cannot be dependent on only one factory, because not just for geopolitical reasons, but something can happen. There can be an accident, and then you have shortages. So definitely we need to extend the scope of production, the scope of suppliers, and these multi-winner tenders can really make it happen. I think especially for generic industry, this is extremely important, and we are explicitly want to put this in. Whether this can lead to increases in prices, I think market for innovatives and generics are pretty different. So with generics, I don't want to sound like an attorney of the representative of the generic industry, but it's true that their margins are very small, that they have been essentially decreasing in the last years, and this is something that is unsustainable, and we have to find the way how to fix this without obviously putting too much pressure on the public health budget. So it's a question of finding the balance, but definitely we have to be careful that in trying to get the lowest possible price, we get to the situation that we just don't have the supply. Of course, it's a question of finding the balance, but I think that what we are trying to do, I think we can get there. Of course, with the prices, the elephant in the room is again Trump with his most favored nation principle. And I want to make one thing clear. European Union is not screwing the US. So it's an outright lie that this is the case. The reason why we have lower prices in the EU is because of the setup of our healthcare systems. So we have social healthcare systems. Some have national health services, some social health insurances, but these are all essentially social systems where you have a monopoly or monopsony on the demand side. You should have state-owned, in most cases, social insurances and health services, which brings to lower prices, because when the state negotiates, obviously it has a better bargaining position than in the US, where you have tens or hundreds of private health insurers, etc. That's the main reasons why prices in Europe are lower. So the social setup of our system. And it's not our fault that US is doing something else. So they're spending 16% of their GDP on health and have worse health outcomes than Europe, which is spending 9% of the GDP. So all the reasons why US has the problem with prices is their problem. It has nothing to do with Europe. And here I think we have to be very tough in protecting our interests as much as possible, because what's going on with prices in the US has nothing to do with Europe, and Europe should not be reflected by it. And definitely Europe should do whatever we can to protect our interests if the new pressure from the US arises there. But I think that if we do this right with the CMA, I don't expect significant increase in prices that could lead to problems in terms of access, etc., etc., etc. So I don't see this happening, but of course in some areas like with the generic industry, some tweaks, as was said, have to be made.
Can I stay, with you a little bit longer, Thomas, because I would like to get an insight on how discussions are going right now in the Parliament. I know that you brought forward, there was your report, and then Sant submitted the amendments. I understand there were a lot of amendments from the different groups. What do you think are the main topics, maybe dividing the groups on what they would like to see in the CMA?
You understand that when we are negotiating, I cannot be completely transparent on this. But I think number of amendments, it's typical for such a big file, important file, so more than 1,000. It's nothing special there, so it happened in other important files as well, with pharma legislation even more, with the GPL. Main point of contention, I would say, will be the other part. So not the part on strategic autonomy and strengthening production in Europe. There are some tweaks there, especially on the scope, whether to include orphan drugs or all orphan drugs or not, but I think we'll get there. The main point of contention will be about the stockpiling and redistribution. And here it's not necessarily about political groups, rules, but it's the member states, because that's the other part about ensuring also equal access. So what we want to have is that in cases there is a shortage in one member state, that we don't have a situation that at the same time you have the same medicine on stockpile in the other member state without any kind of coordination, and that patient cannot get medicine in Bulgaria while you have the same medicine in stockpile in France or Germany or Italy or whatever. So what we want to have European coordination. We want to have clear rules which prohibit that national stockpiling in one country creates shortages in another, and we want to make sure that as a last resort, so I'm emphasizing this because some people question the competence of the EU to do this. So I'm saying as a last resort, in case of shortage in one country, that there is a mandatory redistribution decision made to reallocate the medicine from one country where they have it on stockpile to this country which has the shortage. And this will be decided. The idea is that this is decided not by the European Commission, but by the representatives of the member states. This is the main point of contention, because some member states, especially those who like to stockpile big, some even 6 months in advance, are not very keen on sharing their medicines with the others. But if we want to have common European policy, if we want to have common European coordination of stockpiling and contingency stocks, we have to create this kind of European system. So here I think will be the main points of contention also with the Council. This will be the hardest thing to get through, but I think that in some form we'll be able to get there. The other point is about joint procurement. I know that joint procurement is especially for the industry not their favorite topic. What we try to do is also to give some tweaks for the industry, some advantages, for instance, binding commitments. So the idea is that when there is a joint procurement by several member states, they also have to accept to undertake an obligation to buy certain quantities of medicines several years in advance. By doing that, we are creating really a market. So we are creating a situation that companies can know in advance the quantities that they have to produce, which is especially important for orphan drugs, which in many cases one country maybe has one or two or three patients for the same drug, but if you put them all together, then you actually get the market, you get a significant demand, which then for the industry can also be interesting. So joint procurement is there to stay. We have a big consensus in the parliament that we want to join procurement. Most political groups want to go even further than in the Commission proposal. They want to reduce the number of states that are required for joint procurement. I think there is a big consensus on that. So we have to make sure that this is done in the right way. I think binding commitments is one important factor. But definitely joint procurement will stay in some kind of a format, and we have to make sure that it's regulated in a way which is clear, precise, and gives certainty for the industry as well. But as I said, the thing is going in the direction of even facilitating even more joint procurement than in the Commission proposal. So there's the political mood in the Parliament, and this is what I informed all the stakeholders even before, that they should expect something like that.
Okay, thank you, for a bit of insight. It's great to hear what we think will be the most contentious points. And if we have time, we will get back to stockpiling and joint procurement, obviously, but we'd like to, move to Rodolfo first. If you would like to share, from a company's perspective, obviously you said the CMA has potential, but there could also be some drawbacks if we don't do this right. What are some of your pleas, to co-legislators so that they don't have unintended consequences on the market?
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, talking about Tomislav, it's not an easy comment to make. So it's a very rich statement, very rich, very deep, and very, very, very good. So I think that we, first of all, you talk very well and with very good knowledge. So I think that at the end, the first point that you touched on about what is the cost of CMA and what is the implication of that cost, I think that's a relevant point, because not only we need to take care of the products with supply risk, but also there are other topics like innovation needs to be addressed, and at the end the funding is the same. So we think that the CMA needs to really focus on the issue at hand, the identified issue where we're talking about products with supply vulnerability, because whatever comes, it might be a costly solution. So we need to delimitate that costly solution around the issue that exists without risking overspending beyond that limit, so that we don't compromise other healthcare needs for European countries, right? Now, in that sense, we think that the point of joint procurement that was just mentioned, there is certainly space for joint procurement. We've seen that it can be very effective. We saw that in COVID. We know that it can be effective to mitigate the risks and the issues with supply security for certain products. But we don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. We don't think it can address many needs, and we don't think there is enough evidence that it can really address effectively needs that go beyond the ones that we have already observed. So if you think of more innovative products or certain categories like vaccines, you can get into very unknown territory. I myself, I've operated in many markets, and I've been in different countries, and I've lived in firsthand the consequence of central procurement leading to a succession of lost tenders that led to the closure of a plant, a vaccines plant. Of course, that was done very carefully by Sanofi. We're very committed with supply security and sustainable access, but we had to close. Carefully as it was done, at the end of the day, the world has one less plan for that particular vaccine. If you look back on that, are we more resilient with that outcome? Probably, maybe not. So maybe an unintended consequence of central procurement in a situation where it may not be needed. So we think it needs to be carefully used, carefully deployed, certainly space for it, but not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, a solution for too many topics.
Thank you. I think Rainer wants to respond very quick, but yeah, then if we can move, we'll move on.
Quickly picking up on this one-size-fits-all, going beyond joint procurement. Generally, I think it's very important. We have been looking very carefully into the root causes of the different shortages, of the different challenges for the very broad spectrum of critical medicine we have on the list. And I think one-size-fits-all, that is why we have actually refrained from putting a numerical limit. We said, listen, a certain proportion may be needed to be produced in Europe to give us the really resilient supply chain. And that may be 20% in some cases, and it may be for some other medicines, maybe 50%. And if you look at what is the financial implication, really when trying to set the cursor at the right level, very important, I think, to retain that flexibility. Same thing with the smart procurement criteria. I said, listen, if it is a critical medicine, don't just go for price only. Think of the supply chain, build in some mechanism, and we gave in the Act a number of examples, but we did not say, listen, at a minimum, those three in all the cases, precisely one size fit all. We have a very broad spectrum from pretty innovative patents protected medicines on the list to a range of patent older medicines, and the economic situation, the situation of really producing and securing the supply chain for those medicines, also on the demand side for the health systems, it's a completely different ballgame. Between the member states, one size fits all is not, I mean, if you just look at how procurement is organized in a country, for example, like Denmark, or compared to Germany, completely different ballpark. So I think one size fits all. Please, co-legislators, and when we meet in trilogues, one thing I think what will be important to discuss is to retain some flexibility, because it cannot be just too mechanical, but I do understand, of course, the need to...
I'd like to respond to this.
Wait, okay, sorry.
Very shortly,
Okay.
yeah. No, some flexibility, yes, but definitions have to be clear. So if it is just, say, significant proportion, then everybody can interpret it in different ways. Then we don't have common market anymore. Then we have every tender for itself. So I think we have to be more precise than in the Commission proposal. With some flexibility, but we have to be more precise.
Yeah. A middle ground, yes. Adrian, I would like to get you into this conversation. Obviously, generics industries is a very important file for you. What do you think about what's been said so far, and what are some of the drawbacks that you see if we don't get this right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, when we talk about the Critical Medicines Act, it's also good to kind of think of some key types of medicines like antibiotics or oncology medicines. I'll talk about the generic ones, although I would say like BCG vaccine be also important in this. In Europe, we've had recently major shortages of antibiotic medicines, and in Germany of generic oncology medicines. Major shortages, like impacting even availability for patients. So not just, let's say, a hospital or pharmacy having to call around different wholesalers, but really impacting the patients. And so, this is really a terrible situation for patients. Now, believe it or not, in both of those areas, while there were shortages, prices were continuing to go down. So one of our members did a study on antibiotics 2024 and showed that on the top 10 antibiotics, the prices have declined while there were shortages. In the oncology sector, it's the same. And what's happening then is more and more marketing authorizations for those types of products have also been withdrawn in the context of shortages. So this is showing really there's a problem. So what is happening here? Well, in 85% of the member states' reimbursement systems, the prices can never go up for generic medicines, 85%. For the procurement, it's around 84% are single winner bulk buying tenders. So, this act, by looking at least on the tender side, is key to try and restore some logic to markets that are essentially going into shortage, right? And driving further consolidation. About the cost here, I think Tommy and Rainer are both correct in this. If we look at a lot of the older medicines, we're talking about, in the end, peanuts. I'm looking at my friend Yanis, he's got a big bag of peanuts in his pocket right there. He can afford this. But let me give some examples. In Greece, they introduced multi-award hospital tendering because they had a lot of shortages in the context of the worst financial crisis to ever hit Greece. Okay? And they were able to afford to do this. Why? Because it enabled them to have the medicines they needed in the hospital. These are very inexpensive hospital medicines, so it was doable. In Norway, they've also done some meet criteria for tenders. And there again, basically in 50% of the cases, there was no difference in the cost. In 50% of the cases, there was a slight increase in the cost, but it was totally affordable. So I think this is totally exaggerated. We're talking about medicines. For instance, in Germany, a hospital vial is sold for around €1 a vial. Okay, these are the kind of prices we're talking about here. So I think adjusting these and making it more sustainable is something we can definitely afford.
Mm-hmm. Anybody would like to respond to that, or okay?
Yeah, maybe.
I think, yeah.
I think that multi-winner tenders are extremely important.
Yeah.
So this is what we are pushing for, to have explicit provision. Also, as I said, we cannot define and set prices on European level. We do have transparency directive from 1989, which has never been amended, but it's also not really implemented always in the right way. For instance, the member states are in many cases not following the deadlines for making decisions, 90 plus 90 days, etc. So I think a bit more of an oversight on the Commission's part could be required. But also one thing that is important for us is that when joint procurement decisions are made, that this is the final contract and the prices that is agreed then. I think from the point of view of legal certainty and clarity, this is important so that we don't get into new individual negotiations afterwards by individual member states, because this is also one area where then when there is a strong pressure on prices. And I think here, if we want to be clear and transparent and we want to have harmonized framework, that what is agreed in the contract stemming from the tender should be the final contract with final price that is not changed. I think this is something that we can do on European level to make this requirement, but of course we cannot set the price itself.
Mm-hmm. So some more details and perhaps some different conditions to joint procurement to kind of help make this more appealing for everyone involved. Did you want to respond?
Yes, very quickly. Totally agree on the importance of meet criteria, also multi-winner tenders. Maybe, and it's very, very important to really require as much as necessary, but not too much, because the cost and the affordability is important. I think it's not just because one entity costs €1. If you have millions or billions of those entities, it does add up. But and that's why I did ask for the floor, I would like to also emphasize there are two angles to the question, can we afford? It is, can we afford the cost of those measures? True, and that's why it's very important to really get the cursor at the right position. But also the question, can we afford continuing to suffer shortages? Can we afford that for the health systems? Can we afford it for the patients? And I'm not only talking about the monetary effect, but really the impact on patients. Can we afford really the huge cost that shortages have on our health systems and on individual patients and their treatments. So I think that is the other side of the affordability, or can we afford question that I also wanted to really emphasize, because it was the starting point why I think it is necessary to take the action, and it must still also be strongly in our mind.
Thank you. I think I have to move to audience Q&As if people have questions. Yes, here in the front. There is a mic coming around. Please say who you are if people don't know, and then who your question is for.
Thank you very much. Yanis Natsis, Director of the European Social Insurance Platform. Thank you very much. There. That was better. I agree with a lot of what was said. Actually, just to say from our perspective, we've done internal surveys at EZIP and MEDEF, and we see that in recent years, in light of the shortages, our members actually have accepted to pay higher prices. Of course, I couldn't agree more with Rainer that we shouldn't lose sight of the big picture, and even if we're looking at minimal prices, as Adrian put them, when you look at the big scale, then those minimal prices become a problem. But my question is more forward-looking. We're discussing the Critical Medicines Act. We are in favor of that. Of course, now the way that the negotiations are heading, it should be called the Medicines Act, because there is a trend to increase the scope and include anything and everything in it, and we should be very careful about that. But the second point is, what do we get in return? Where are the guarantees that we will have fewer shortages down the road? Are those guarantees tangible, in the sense of we are willing to invest more money to grant all sorts of benefits that have just been described and are included in the Commission's proposal and also in the Parliament's quite progressive opinion under the leadership of Mr. Sokol? But where are the guarantees for the tangible return on this multifaceted investment and support? And especially, will we see fewer shortages? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanis. Who would like to respond? Yes.
Yeah, well, I think as was pointed out, the legislation is not a legislation with a mandated price increase, right? It's a series of criteria that need to be complied with in order to benefit from some sort of award or some kind of special treatment in the procurement, or to a lesser extent in the pricing reimbursement. And so if the companies don't meet the criteria, they're not going to be able to benefit from the award. So if, for instance, supply chain security or a localization criteria within there, if they're not complying, then I'm guessing your members are not going to give an award. So I think there is this quid pro quo or understanding within the legal legislation. I agree with Tommy. I think there has to be a minimum level of harmonization in terms of what we mean, because otherwise it will be difficult to implement in practice.
Okay. We're running a bit out of time, but if anyone else wants to respond to.
Quickly, I think if we have a tender where the requirement is to have, say, a second API supplier, I think that would be then also in the contractual documentation. I think that gives you the guarantee. And in the CMA, where medicines are not tendered out in public procurement, but just going through normal pricing and reimbursement, there is really the push, the invitation to member states to apply exactly the same logic and then have as conditions for the pricing reimbursement those things that we really want to see, that we need to see as society, those smart procurement considerations and mechanisms that need to be in place. Also, when a member state grants financial support for building or expanding a factory, and I mean, and there is actually a relatively recent case example that is underlying this rule in the Critical Medicines Act. It says very clearly, if public money goes to build or increase manufacturing capacity here in Europe, it cannot be that then whenever there's a crisis, a shortage, it all goes to Saudi Arabia or wherever else they may be paying more. It must be Europe first, and also then having the guarantee that we do benefit as society from the investment we made as a society.
I think we have very strong mechanisms. One thing that was not touched upon until now is strategic projects. So the idea is that strategic projects for building production capacity of critical medicine should have priority in terms of faster permitting, in terms of having preference over other criteria like environmental criteria. So I don't really think that fighting shortages and secure supply of medicine should be the primary criterion. And definitely, if we make the Buy European, the meet criteria clear, if we make them very strong, definitely that will bring a lot of production to Europe. So I think that in terms of security of supply chains, if we are ambitious enough, I think that definitely there will be an impact. I know that that we have the question of the impact assessment and the whole thing, but I think Critical Medicines Alliance has done a lot on this in the beginning, and I think a lot of data has shown that this can really have an impact. And just one comment on health insurances, because this is the question from health insurances. One thing that is not your competence, but that I see in some member states, is that also health insurance funds do not have, in many cases, clear criteria on which medicines to put on their lists. So some countries have very clear cost effectiveness criteria with number of euros per quality adjusted life year that makes medicine worthwhile to purchase, etc. But in some countries, these criteria are really not clear. So they're very broad, very vague, and there is too much discretion and not enough transparency within the health insurance funds when they make decisions on which medicines to put on their list. So this is not something that we can change on the European level because that's a national competence, but it's also one thing to take into account, that there can be a lot more efficiencies within the national health insurance funds when they actually decide which medicines to buy and whatnot.
Okay, sorry. Okay, yes, Rodolfo, you can have the last word.
Very good point, and particularly on the meat criteria, very important. We fully believe it needs to be continues to be more and more embedded. One point in the question that drew my attention was is it becoming a medicines act instead of critical? I think that's a super important aspect. We really believe it should continue to be a focus on critical medicines, not broadening too widely beyond that, because of the risk of unintended consequences. For vaccines, there is a big risk. It's a very complex system for distribution, dispensing, and vaccination of populations. Joint procurement can disturb that and can have unintended negative consequences for patients. For innovation, the same. So innovation is more difficult to get around with joint procurement, and there can be unintended and unexpected negative consequences from an operational point of view.
Just because this was kind of a criticism towards the Parliament. I understand the question, because Parliament wants to extend the scope. So not all parts of CMA necessarily have to apply to everything, but I think the meat criteria should apply as broad as possible. And this is something that I will fight for very strongly, because I said in the global geopolitical context that we are now, we have to fight to bring production to Europe and to retain production in Europe. So on the meat criteria, that part of CMA should apply to as broad categories of medicines as possible. For instance, one thing. Orphan drugs. I think there are very strong arguments why we need to have stimulation for production of orphan drugs in Europe, why we need to have joint procurement of orphan drugs, and I will personally fight very strongly for that part. On some other things we can be flexible, but on the meat criteria and procurement, here we have to go as broad as possible. That's my position at least.
Thank you so much, Tomislav. Sorry, I know we could talk for another hour, but unfortunately we have to get going. But yeah, thank you so much for this discussion. I think it was great. I hope you also enjoyed it. And thank you for the audience for your attention. Now we're going to welcome back Sarah Wheaton on stage, and I will see you this afternoon. Thank you.